hello, and hello. Awesome. Hello. Good, good evening, everybody. So sorry for the late start. We had a couple tech issues in the beginning, but right now we are live. And so for those of you who are here, for those of you who might have been waiting, I really appreciate your patience. Right now, I'm going to go ahead and pull up the link on my side so I can see you all and see the chat. So just give me 1 second while I get situated. Awesome. So, folks, I want to welcome you back to the Campaign for Community Control. And I want to thank you so much for being here for our 4th live listening session. This is currently being streamed live, as you know. So for those of you who might know somebody else who's interested in this topic, I want you to go ahead and take the link. I want you to text it. I want you to email it. I want you to send it to anybody who you think might want to come and see what we have going on today. So while I spend the next couple of minutes allowing folks to join, maybe some folks, came and then left while we were trying to get situated, allow me to introduce myself to you. For those of you who've never come to a live listening session before, my name is Imani Yassin, and tonight I'm your host. I'm also a native of Baltimore City, and I work in the housing and community development space. Specifically, I'm also the director of strategic initiatives at Parity. So in addition to that work, I also lead with what is called the Campaign for Community Control. So the Campaign for Community Control is a citywide, multidimensional effort to engage our larger community in the quest to address Baltimore City's vacant property crisis through educational offerings, through engagement opportunities, and by advocating for legislation and policies that support measures of community control of land and property. So we use a reparative lens in our work, and we acknowledge the history of land dispossession, along with racial discrimination in housing and wealth extraction to inform different pathways towards a Baltimore that truly is equitable and just. So given all that, our first order of business has been really pushing to establish our city's first community-directed land bank. And I'll talk about what a land bank is a little bit later. So before I get into that, I want to give you some opportunities to get involved with our campaign. So for those of you who want to get involved in the Campaign for Community Control, you can do so in a number of ways. The first is I want you to go ahead and sign and share our petition to establish Baltimore City's first land bank. So I'm going to drop that down here in the chat for those of you who might be able to see that. In addition, one other thing you might be able to do is volunteer, right? We can't do the work of creating and offering these educational opportunities along with presenting or canvassing communities by ourselves. So if you or anyone you know who might be interested in that, I'm going to go ahead and drop our contact link so you can contact us and volunteer. Oh, that's a little bit long, so I'll just drop this link. You should be able to see that. So in addition to signing a petition and volunteering, you can also stay connected. You can follow us on social media, particularly on Instagram at Create Community Control. That's our handle. And then you can also follow us on TikTok. The handle is the same, at Create Community Control. So the last thing you can do to support us is to host a learning session. If you're interested in educating your community about land banks or about measures of community control, you can host an in-person or virtual learning session to provide attendees with insights into the purpose and benefits of land banks or measures of community control. So just reach out to us via the link that I dropped, and we'd be happy to set something up for you and the people that you serve. So before I welcome our guests, who I'm really super excited about, I want to give you just a little bit of a background on the true implications of the vacant properties in Baltimore City. So as we all know, many of you who are here are experts. Many of you who are here probably live in the city of Baltimore, but Baltimore City has a long history of racist housing policies, practices, land use decisions, and investment practices that have resulted in inequities that continue to affect communities to this day. One of the symbolic legacies of those racist housing policies and practices is the existence of nearly 15,000 vacant buildings and almost 21,000 vacant lots throughout the city. And the majority of those properties, as you might assume, exist in Black communities, which leaves an inequitable weight on Black communities to carry the burden of all those issues that are related to vacancy. So here's just a couple quick facts for those of you who are new to our space. First, according to a 2020 report by the Able Foundation, approximately 16.4% of all residential properties in the city of Baltimore are vacant. And that makes our rate of vacancy one of the higher rates of vacancy in the entire country. Fact two, a report by the Baltimore Neighborhood Indicators Alliance reveals that Baltimore neighborhoods like Sandtown Winchester, like Harlem Park, and the Middle East had concentrations of vacant housing that in some cases exceed 30%. Which not only creates a diminished tax base for those people living in that community, which, you know, our tax base contributes to a lot of the amenities that we need, like our schools and our stores and our other items, but it also creates a negative impact on the overall health that those folks have access to. Third, research consistently shows that vacant and abandoned and deteriorated properties reduce the value of the surrounding properties. So one example of that is, I think in Ohio, studies showed that if your property was nearby or next to a vacant property, your property value decreased by almost 10%. Fact four, according to the cost of vacancy, which was a report put together by Mary Miller and Mac McComas of the Johns Hopkins 21st Centuries Initiative, research shows that Baltimore City loses almost $200 million each year on vacant properties. And then last but not least, vacant properties are also, as I said before, associated with poor outcomes of health, poor states of emotional well-being, and poor educational outcomes. So we know this issue is big. It isn't new. And so the question then arises for us as we work to address the magnitude of this issue: how do we ensure that these solutions are equitable, and what role do community members play in the process? It's our belief that community should be directing that process. It's our belief that community should be at the forefront of that process. And it's our belief that the best solution to addressing the vacant property crisis in Baltimore City is a new entity whose sole focus is on the eradication of vacant properties only. And we believe that new entity should be a land bank. So for those of you who are new to this conversation, a land bank is a public entity with unique powers, unique legal powers, to put vacant, abandoned, and deteriorated properties back to productive use. So there are over 300 land banks or land banking programs operating across the United States, and they serve as a national best practice at addressing vacancy. So many cities across the country have been successful at leveraging a land bank to put thousands of properties back on the tax rolls, putting them back to productive use. So I've talked enough, and I hope by this time many of you have joined and shared the invitation, but I want to go ahead and welcome our really exciting guest, Nika Nandy. So I'm going to bring her right on in. Hello, hello, hello. Oh, whoa, whoa. Let's switch it.
All right.
There we go. What it do though?
Hey, listen, it do what it do.
It do what it do. Well, welcome, welcome, welcome. Thank you so much, Nika, for being available today to join us on this live session. This is our fourth live session. I can't say how excited I am to have you. For those of you who don't know, this is a Baltimore legend, a big wig out here in these streets, one of the community development experts of our time. So I'm extremely lucky and fortunate to have you here. But before we get into some of the questions to engage folks with, why don't you take a second, and I always ask the guests who come on to share what I've coined as their Baltimore story. So what's your Baltimore story?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. So I always have to posit, because Baltimore be like, was you born here or
Right.
no? And so I always start my Baltimore story with the fact that I was actually born in DC. And
what?
Yeah. Can you imagine that?
I had no clue. Okay.
And moved to Baltimore County actually when I was about 3, and spent the vast majority of my childhood in Baltimore County, in Essex and Parkville, before there were large populations of Black folks. And so I have a intimate understanding and experience with personal racism in Baltimore. And it really informed how I show up in the world. In fact, because of that, the rest of my family lived in Baltimore City. and most of the dope activities for Black folks during the 80s and 90s were in Baltimore City. So I spent a lot of my free time in Baltimore City looking around like, why I gotta live over here with these folks that's treating me sideways when my people are in town. And so, when I was in high school, my mother, in her infinite wisdom, because I was not doing well in school despite being bright, decided to move to the city, which gave me an opportunity to go to Poly and to graduate from there and to really begin my city roots. And a lot of the way that I look at Baltimore regionally is defined by those experiences as a child in the county. So, folks will be like, "Wait a minute, now, you really a county girl," and I'm like, that may be very true. But I have spent the entirety of my adulthood in Baltimore City, in particular, living in Old West Baltimore. So because I went to the Morgan State University, and one of the things that they taught us there, that's right, in the School of Business, was that it was important to be a homeowner, right? The importance of home ownership. And so once I graduated, one of the first things I wanted to do after I had secured my little job was to buy a house. And so I bought a home in a neighborhood called Heritage Crossing. And that opportunity was afforded to me because of the dismantling of public housing. Where I live used to be called Murphy Homes. It was high-rise and low-rise projects. And when the federal HUD determined that they had created a mess by housing people in high rises without properly investing in the physical infrastructure of the buildings, but also the programming and the wider community, they decided in the 90s that they were going to start tearing them down, without fully understanding that this was actually people's communities, no matter how poor they were, no matter how big the holes in the social fabric were. These were people's communities and people wanted to stay. And so those public housing residents, mostly Black women, mostly single mothers, banded together, organized, and sued federal HUD for taking their community from them. And from that 1994 HUD versus Thompson versus HUD lawsuit, Heritage Crossing, the neighborhood that I was able to purchase in, was made to be, as a result of that lawsuit, a low to moderate income home ownership and rental unit development. And so it is a debt that I owe to those women, many of whom were not able to return to their community despite winning the case. That is how I come into the work, because I was able to buy that house. And then years later, I looked around and was like, wait a minute, why does the neighborhood, our little, cul-de-sac, our little area is tree-lined streets and looking cute and all of that. But the wider neighborhood, we're surrounded by blight. We're surrounded by the Highway to Nowhere. We're surrounded by Harlem Park and Upton, two of Baltimore's, most vibrant communities in one way. The physical infrastructure in those communities is heavily dilapidated. And so that started me to look into, how did we get to this point? More importantly, what are we doing about it? And that is how Fight Like Be More was born, as a social, environmental, and economic justice initiative led by the village and informed by the data, really to figure out how we can develop or expand the vibrancy, expand the revitalization that is happening in neighborhoods, not just in Old West Baltimore, but in Park Heights, in historic East Baltimore, in Cherry Hill and Westport, all over the city, where in particular, where we see concentrations of blight, which would not surprise people. It's in the neighborhoods that we have started calling the Black Butterfly, because they have concentrations of Black residents.
Gotcha. So two things that I wanted to call out on what you said that I just love, especially about Baltimore in particular. Baltimore is you're not gonna do me like that type of place. We're just not going for it. And I think that's the energy behind kind of that lawsuit is like, you may have an opinion or a thought around my neighborhood. However, it's my community,
Right.
and I think that that speaks to a lot of, Baltimore City, communities who have suffered the long-term disinvestment and distress, whose physical, appearance is one way, but there's a spirit, right? There's a spirit of resilience and there's a spirit of pride still in that this is my community. You know what I mean? And you're going to put some respect on it as well. So I love that. And the same is that same passion I feel like lives in you. And what brings you to this work is, no, I'm not okay with that. And so we're not going to take it. So I appreciate that, but I want to bring us to kind of our topic today, right? Which is kind of it's layered because we're going to talk about kind of reparations. We're going to talk about land reclamation and land stewardship. So just to kind of ground us in that, let's talk about the basics and let's define some concepts. So how would you actually define land reclamation and land stewardship, and then why are both of those concepts so important?
So land reclamation, what you'll see in many Black neighborhoods, not just in Baltimore, but in Richmond, in Philly, in Brooklyn, in Oakland, is and all over, not just in the urban context, but places in the rural areas and in the deeper South, right? Is these historic Black communities. Many of them have been around for hundreds of years. So, for example, the Sarah Ann Street houses in Poppleton have been inhabited uninterrupted by Black people since right after, I think, 1867. And so you see Black people in spaces, creating community, creating economic systems, creating institutions, and having the weight of the law and the weight of economic policy displace them, right, from those neighborhoods and disrupt all that they had created in those spaces. And so land reclamation is about the process by which we go and take back what has been taken from us, right? In a very simple, in a very simple way, like we are asserting our natural human right to reclaim the spaces that were taken from us unjustly, unethically, immorally, and oftentimes against what was the law, right? And then the second piece is from this framework of stewardship. So we often talk about property in terms of ownership. And that is a very capitalistic way of looking at the land. In fact, one of the lessons that I think we all should have learned from COVID is we need the planet. The planet doesn't need us. This planet can exist and keep spinning around, the sun and be it, orbited without any human life. But in order for us to be well and to live well, we actually need the planet, which means we have to provide care. We have to steward and take care of the land and stop necessarily thinking about controlling it and instead, focus on living in alignment with it. And so stewardship is this concept that you see very heavily in all indigenous societies, but in the Chesapeake Bay Basin, one of the things when the Europeans first arrived, they thought that this land was, they deemed it a no man's land because they didn't think it was being cared for, because in their mind, cared for meant clear cut farms with little neat rows of, potatoes or whatever else, right? When that is not how the indigenous people here cared for the land. That's not how they cared for the forest. They did companion planting. They took care, of gathering things where they naturally grew with each other. And so they were really taking care of the land. They were stewarding the land, but because it did not look how the Europeans thought land care or land ownership looked, they deemed it a no man's land. And so stewardship really centers how we can live in alignment with the planet, but also it focuses on our responsibility to the land more than it focuses on our rights to it.
Okay, I love that. And it also makes me think maybe we should be the campaign for community stewardship, not community control. I'm like, dang, maybe we chose the wrong word here. No, but I love that paradigm shift, because you're absolutely correct, right? We need the land more than the land needs us, and it is our responsibility to care for it like we would care for what, our home, because it is our home, and we would care for ourselves because we don't exist without it. So I love that. And also around land reclamation, another natural question that pops up for me, Nika, is where do our indigenous folks fall into this, right? Into this conversation? And because obviously, you know, we were able to build economic systems, we had homes and so on. But I'm curious because I wonder if other people are thinking that too. When I think about land reclamation, you know, where does that community kind of fall in this conversation as well?
That is a good question. I think that one of the things that we need to do is be engaging with folks in the indigenous American community, maybe through the American Indian Center, which is in the city, to figure out exactly what that looks like. Typically, when I'm engaging in this conversation, I'm speaking from the lens of a person of African descent, right? I'm speaking from the lens of a person whose ancestors were trafficked here, who were, you know, brought here against their will. And but I recognize that even in all of the displacement, because one of the things that enslavement created was a cycle of displacement for Black people out of Africa into the Caribbean or into the deeper South, then into the North, then back to the South. You know, people are now moving back down South. So it has created a number of cycles of displacement, but also recognizing that we were not the first people on this land who were displaced. Because in order for us to have been brought here in the way that we were and put over and responsible for caring for crops on the land, the people who were here already had to be displaced, right? Or were displaced in that process. And so there is a space for that dialogue, and we should be entering into it. And I also think because we are looking at things through the lens of stewardship, we are beginning the process of respecting that, because that is the way in which indigenous people here cared for the land. And that is also the way in which is the same framework that our ancestors in West Africa, in Central Africa, used to care for the land as well. So those things are in alignment, but I think there is a space for greater conversation for our indigenous community here.
Absolutely. And I completely agree with you. So let's move along to our second question. So can these concepts of land reclamation and land stewardship, be applied to address the historical injustices and disparity in Baltimore City, particularly as it relates to vacant properties? Where does land reclamation and land stewardship fall into the conversation around the vacant property crisis, as we've coined it?
So interestingly enough, a lot of these notions about addressing historical injustice really center up around our ability to show up fully as ourselves in a place and in a space, right? Showing up in community, being able to sit on our stoop and drink a beer and not be bothered by Baltimore City Police Department, or being able to be standing on the corner chatting with some other folks and not be seen as criminal, right? Not have that be seen as a criminal activity. And so it has a lot to do with how community is seen, but more importantly, it really has to do with us not seeking inclusion, instead creating intersectional space and creating intersectionality in our neighborhoods and in the ways in which we develop our neighborhoods. And so it's important for us to, one, have a clear understanding of how we got here. And so one of the things in particular about Baltimore, and it goes back to what you said, is that there's an energy in Black Baltimore in particular of like, we are not just going to allow you to do anything to us. And that comes from the fact that Black people have been in the Chesapeake Bay Basin for one of the longest times of anywhere in what we call the United States. And because of that, the resistance to racism, white supremacy, and all of these other things that come along with it has been here the longest, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so we can use the lessons of the abolition movement and the work of Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman to inform what we're doing today. We also can look at what Isaac Myers did with his co-op, shipbuilding co-op, and use that to inform what we're doing today in terms of community and economic development. We had to, look at all of the things, the seat of the, civil rights movement, Thurgood Marshall. These things come out of Baltimore, and even the Black Power, even the Black Power movement, the mosque on Islamic Way was like Muslim mosque number 1 or 3 or something. It was one of the earliest mosques outside of New York. And so we have been in this struggle and in this resistance for a long time, but it is key for us to understand how these things come together. Because when we understand how they come together and how we got here, we can really strategize and create tactics to fight them. And how land stewardship and land reclamation play a key part in that is because they fundamentally shift how we think about, how we engage with, how we monetize or commercialize land, right? Because that is the underpinning, like this capitalist imperative is the underpinning for much of the displacement, for much of the slum lording, for much of all the predatory real estate practices. Is all about making profit. So as we shift our mindset from this notion of ownership to stewardship, and that doesn't mean people won't own things. It just means that you are focused on your responsibility, not your rights. We get closer to addressing those injustices. And the reclamation piece is all about we're not waiting. We're not waiting for City Hall to do anything. We're not waiting for Annapolis. We're certainly not waiting for them down there to do nothing. And we're not waiting.
Don't start. Don't.
Hey, listen. We're not waiting for the people down in DC. We're not waiting for the banks. We're not waiting for philanthropy. We are going to use our cultural technology to show up and steward the land, to show up and reclaim the land. And where we need to, we will use the law to reclaim the land. We will use, money to reclaim the land. But it's all about repositioning how we're thinking about things as a strategy to move forward.
Absolutely. And one of the key words that comes up for me as I listen to you talk about this is really agency and exercising that, through responsibility and taking whatever means necessary to create, the best spaces for us and our family, et cetera. So hearing all that, want to transition to one of the pieces that you're most well known for, because I think it gives kind of a great entry point to our conversation around land banks as well, is the Anatomy of Blight. So let's talk about that a little bit. What is the Anatomy of Blight report? And just provide a little bit of background for folks who are like, never heard of this.
Sure.
But yeah.
So as I began to do the work, I started to see patterns in legislation. I started to see patterns in certain practices. I started to see patterns in certain funding vehicles that were causing our neighborhoods to have concentrations of vacancy, abandonment, properties in poor condition, underutilized properties, and misutilized properties. And I wanted to take a look at laying out a timeline so people could see exactly how these things built upon themselves, because we hear a lot of conversation about Ordinance 610, which was the first residential housing segregation ordinance that was passed in 1910, I think, in Baltimore, and set the stage for those, discriminatory housing laws. But we don't hear about tax sale and tax assessments, and how tax assessments and collection and how that is a part of the problem. We don't hear about ground rent. We don't hear as much about eminent domain and highway construction. And I wanted to paint a very clear picture for people, specifically because what I noticed when I was talking to people in community is that people felt like the neighborhoods look like they do because we're trifling. Now, no, you should not be throwing trash out your car window or on the ground when you're walking down the street. but there also is a lack of
It's
public
more.
cans, right? There's also the reality that when you have no grocery store and you are relying on corner stores and carryouts, that they create more trash, and thus there's
Exactly.
going to be, there's going to be a greater need for trash receptacles in places where there aren't trash receptacles. And so there are bigger issues than people's personal choices that are causing the condition of community. And I really wanted to flush that out, because it is not triflingness. It isn't solely, and it isn't predominantly triflingness that has caused conditions in community. So that's one of the reasons why I wanted to, we engaged in doing that report.
Okay. So before we get into kind of defining the report and what, some of the findings were, I want to bring it back a bit and kind of ground us in blight as a word. Because I realized as we were talking about this, we didn't even define blight. So for those of you who are listening, like, what do they mean? They keep talking about blight. Blight is just a word that we use to talk about the deteriorated state of community. So when communities have, as Nika talked about, a concentration of vacant properties, you see things boarded up, that is blight. So just wanted to put that there. But now, as you talk about what drove the reason for the report, in the report, what were you researching and what did you find?
So in addition to doing some deeper research into the different reasons, right, and how we got here, we also took a look at a various number of other reports that focused on vacancy, that focused on community development, whether it was the planning department's plan for Baltimore, or it was DCHD's community conversations. We looked at a number of other reports and a number of other data stores, Baltimore Neighborhood Indicators Alliance, to really get a picture of what people are doing to address blight, right? What people are thinking about, what people are planning for, and what people are actually doing. And from that, we recognize that policy is the greatest creator of blight. Policy. And when we're talking about local, state, and federal policy, that is the primary 80% of blight, in my estimation, is created by policies coming out of those three institutions, right? And then the other part is, personal, how people are conducting themselves. And so we also went about creating a list of policy recommendations, practice recommendations, and funding streams that we felt like would support community leading, stewarding, and owning properties to remediate blight in community. And so there are more than 20 recommendations in the report that really focus on that. And so some of the big ones were coming up with, there are no zoning regulations for accessory dwelling units. So that's like if you wanted to build a tiny house behind your house because you have an elderly parent that you want to be able to care for, but you don't necessarily want them in your house because you got 17 million steps. Or you have a young adult child that's returning home from college that you don't necessarily want in your house because you want them to gain a sense of independence, right? And you don't want
coming home from college.
Right. You don't want to see the dishes in the sink or whatever the case may be. We don't have zoning regulations for accessory dwelling units. And that's something that will support intergenerational living, which is one of the ways in which you can really create healthy and vibrant communities. So that was one of the policy recommendations. Another one was a community Brownsfield tax credit program. So Brownsfield tax credits allow our federal tax credits that help remediate properties that have high levels of toxicity. You typically see it used in former industrial sites like down around the waterfront, right? In Harbor, where there used to be a hexavalent chromium or some such plant, right? Or they were processing heavy chemicals, and one of the leftovers was, these heavy metals. You see it used to remediate, but you don't see it used to remediate asbestos and lead and silica and other toxins that were used heavily in the early 1900s to build houses. But it could be used for that. But community developers, community folks don't know how to access that credit. So creating a program of technical assistance to help people access the Brownsfield credit is another example. And then to require tax lien purchases, and this is very technical, at the end of a tax sale foreclosure process, the tax lien purchasers are able to foreclose on someone's house and then do nothing. Not take responsibility for the taxes, not take responsibility for the upkeep or maintenance, but hold the ability to sell that property to a third party or to displace, make homeless the person living in the property without having to pick up the deed. And so one of the policy recommendations we had was that lien purchasers must pick up that tax lien. They must pick up the deed to the property and thus pay the subsequent taxes and take responsibility for that property within 90 days or lose their right, or that, basically their foreclosure action would be voided. And so those are examples of the policy practice and funding stream recommendations that are inside the anatomy of Baltimore's white paper. One of the big ones that we're going to talk about is the land, what we called or defined a land acquisition and disposition authority. And that would really allow, it would be a quasi-government entity that would allow for people to access blighted properties and bring them back into productive condition as defined by the neighborhood.
Absolutely. So want to get into this because I think you said the Land Acquisition and Disposition Authority is a not fancy, but just another way of speaking about what we define as a land bank. So for those of you here who just came into the conversation, as Nika put it eloquently, a land bank or a land acquisition and disposition authority is essentially just an entity. Think of it as an organization whose sole focus is to acquire properties, meaning take ownership of properties, to hold, right, and maintain or stabilize those properties so they don't fall down and they don't look unsightly or just continue to create harm, and then dispose of properties, not throw away as in dispose, but to determine who is going to receive the properties according to community identified priorities. And so, as I said at the beginning of this video, there are over 300 land banks or land banking programs, or as Nika called it, land acquisition and disposition authorities, that are operating throughout the United States. And so land banks have really been considered a national best practice at addressing blight. And because of that, there's so many cities, like we look at Cleveland, we look at Detroit, we look at Houston, we look at Syracuse, we look at Atlanta, and there are thousands of properties that these cities have been able to bring back to productive use, give away for free, create opportunities for developers, create opportunities for folks to start businesses. And what I like specifically, and I want to talk just a second about Detroit's land banking program, is that they provide technical assistance, right? I think that that's a missing piece kind of in our sphere right now. And I'm not saying that it doesn't exist. There are some places that you can go and understand how to develop properties. But to be able to not only access a property for little to no cost, but to be helped through the process of developing that property, or to be supported through engaging community about what that property is going to become, I think is a really important piece in this whole puzzle of addressing vacant property. So to that end, my next question for you, Nika, is what role can a community-directed land bank play in the process of reparations, particularly in communities that are affected by vacancy and where Black populations have decreased over time? What role do land banks play in reparations?
So I think it actually depends very much on the values of the land bank and what the land bank, what its purpose is. And so, as we are working through developing land bank legislation in Baltimore, we have to be very intentional about because a land bank could become a vehicle for developers and for the money class and for the capitalists and industrialists to easily move properties through, right, back into their ownership without, paying the debt that they owe for destroying community. if we are not careful, if we are not intentional, and if we are not putting into place very clear language and very clear practices that are harm reductive and that also are designed to repair, repair community. And so for us, one of the things that we have had a lot of dialogue and conversation about, because of what we heard in the Anatomy of Blight report, because what we read in terms of what others were doing around the nation, is to really have a very clear, very precise vehicle for community control. And so in our estimation, the legislation needs to be amended to include a neighborhood advisory board, right? And that neighborhood advisory board would really make sure that all of the disposition and, to a lesser degree, the acquisition of properties were done in alignment with what the neighbors, right, what the neighbors have stated that they wanted. But that also requires that each neighborhood has a neighborhood plan, an explicit, written out, well-designed, well-researched plan for what community wants, right? And the way to accomplish that is for each neighborhood to receive funding, right? So that people can actually get paid. Because one of the things that we have seen happen is there's a lot of neighborhood planning that goes on, but the people who are doing the work, and this is work, this is,
labor.
This is labor. I mean, this data, and that is data collection, it's data analysis, it is comparative, some of it is cultural anthropology. There's a lot of it. You got a historical buildings, historical land research, and all of these things. People are using their talents and their skills and their desire to do, and they're not being compensated for. It's work that the developers get the most benefit from.
Exactly.
And so, on the other end. And so I think it is key that we have to have neighborhood plans in every neighborhood. Those plans must be developed by folks in the neighborhood, and those people should be paid. And then the neighborhood advisory board inside, and this is separate from the land banks board, operational board. So this would be a neighborhood advisory board, and each neighborhood would have oversight over the decisions that are being made. The decisions basically would be checked against the neighborhood plan. Is this in alignment? Is that in alignment? If it's not, then they get to raise the flag to the land bank and say, no, this cannot go forward. And that's in addition to the notification requirements that are already in the legislation, and whatever policies and procedures that the land bank board puts together. The other piece is a land bank, because it is quasi-government, can do race-specific programming in ways that the government cannot do without running afoul, or potentially running foul of the Equal Protection Clause of the Constitution, which basically says the government cannot do things based on race. Which is interesting, because the whole point of the 14th Amendment was to make Black people full citizens. The thing that it did not do really is give teeth to repair the harm that had been done by the period of enslavement. And so now the 14th Amendment is actually used to stop the advance of Black people, because it cripples the government from doing race-specific reparative programming for Black people. Now they figured out how to do reparations for anybody and everybody else, but when it comes to us,
they sure did. We're not going to get into that.
They can't figure it out. But a land bank can allow for race-specific programming, especially if you can demonstrate, because we still have to be prepared for a constitutional challenge, because we know with all of this DEI stuff that's going on, the backlash, that we have to be prepared for somebody to attempt
new term.
to attempt to challenge the land bank on that basis. But where we can show, the land bank can show, be positioned to show the harms, how we're addressing redlining in particular, where we can tie it directly to racist housing policy, then we can substantiate that it is not a violation of the Equal Protection Clause. And so that is how we intend to, one, leverage the land bank toward reparations and stewardship, but also how we intend to make sure that it is neighborhood controlled, right? That the neighborhood, the people who have been there, have access to the process, have decision-making authority to the process, have oversight in the process as well.
Absolutely. So I want to also take a step back to give folks a little bit of context about the legislation, what it does currently, because right now we're talking about an amendment. We're talking about adding a community advisory panel who would be able to say yes or no to development and or large scale acquisitions based on whether or not they align to a neighborhood plan. Now, I completely agree with you with the funding that's needed and really the order, right, and the structure that's needed to the neighborhood planning process across the city. And the community engagement that's required. I think that one of the other challenges is that oftentimes in community, the neighborhood council or the neighborhood association is not always representative of all the members of the community. So we want to recognize that and invite folks, of all ages, backgrounds, or whatever, to be participatory and see benefit in sharing their voice in the first place, but also supporting people through the process. But to take it a step back and widen our lens a little bit, let me tell you just some basic facts about this legislation. So the legislation that we're talking about, entitled, Baltimore's Land Bank legislation, effectively would create Baltimore's first land bank authority. So it's land bank enabling, right? Like it would actually just create a new entity. That's first. This entity would be a nonprofit entity, and in the legislation of itself, should it pass, it automatically assigns this entity with certain legal powers, limitations, and tax exemptions so that obviously they can operate more effectively with the property acquisition and disposition. And also, if the land bank passes, it automatically creates a board of directors, which is what Nika was starting to talk about a little bit in the beginning of the answer to that, previous question. So in that, it also assigns powers and duties to that board of directors, and it establishes the selection process and the terms for those board of directors. So some of the requirements and powers that the legislation also gives the land bank is that the land bank will be required to issue annual reports. It will be required to hold public meetings on all of its activity. It would also have the power to issue and refund bonds. It would have the power to provide loans and grants. It would have the power to collect fees. And it would have the power to acquire and sell, lease, and dispose of property according to neighborhood outcome, not property, not highest bid. And also based on public policies and not based on relationship or, based on some of the things that may or may not be happening behind the veil. So, the status of the legislation, where are we in the process? The land bank legislation was actually introduced a little bit over a year ago. It was introduced in March 2023 and currently is in the Ways and Means Committee, and we're awaiting a hearing date for this legislation. Another piece of background as it relates to kind of the legal picture is that Maryland state law already permits a local government to establish a land bank authority. And actually, I was hoping that Baltimore would be the first, but there is a city in Maryland, Nika, you may remember the name, but we just got word that there's a city in the state of Maryland who has actually created their first land bank.
I think it's on the Eastern Shore. It may be Cambridge.
I think it's Cambridge.
Yeah, maybe.
Don't quote us, but there is actually a land bank that just got established in the state of Maryland recently. So what is prohibiting the passing of this bill? What will need to happen in order for this bill to pass? In order for the bill to pass, a majority of the members on the Ways and Means Committee, and you can look them up, will need to vote in the affirmative on this bill. And then also one of the major social barriers to the success of this bill is that, our Department of Housing and Community Development has taken a public stance that basically states that there is not a need for this new entity, that, they can already do all of the work that a land bank would do. And we can have different opinions about that, but that is one of the, social barriers, is that there are some folks in the space who don't think that a land bank is necessary because we already have a local, entity, DHCD. Yeah, am I saying all the letters? DHCD, who is dealing with the vacant property prices. So that's that. And so how does, another one thing I want to talk about is the composition and the powers assigned to the board per the legislation as it currently stands, okay? So currently the legislation grants the land bank power to establish a board of directors, and that board will be responsible for creating procedures for appointment. They would be responsible for creating procedures for term length, for removal of people from the board, for the election of a chair on the board, and for the other general powers of the land bank. I want to also call out that myself, Nika, Crystal Okafor, Bree Jones, and Shayna Roth Gormley all sat together for weeks and created a list of policy recommendations for this board in order to make sure that should we establish a land bank, it is operating in true equity and in the best interest, and also has measures of community control. We also crafted a land bank vision memorandum, which is going to become public as well, so you all can get a picture into what the vision is for this entity should it be established. And then last, on this makeup of this board, the legislation provides for an 11-member board that consists of 4 public officials, some real estate professionals and housing professionals, and 2 community residents who are residing in communities with high vacancy rates. Although that board, there's some challenges, good and bad, we can, talk about that in detail. What Nika has already shared is that we are also proposing that there should be a community advisory panel in the land bank, so that there is a check and balance prior to certain things even getting to that board, to make sure that the development happens in the best interest of the community. So now that I gave that backdrop, I want to move us to the next question. We got a couple more questions, and I really want to get us out of here in the next 10, 15 minutes. So we started a couple minutes late, so no problem. But what community control measures, Nika, would you recommend to make the legislation stronger and more reflective of land reclamation, or reparations focused agenda, other than the community advisory panel that we discussed?
I think that, if I'm being 100% honest, getting the community advisory panel correct is the key. Getting that piece, that the legislation already has some notification provisions, getting that piece in the policies and procedures of the land bank, that is the key piece. The neighborhood planning, paying people to do neighborhood planning, and making sure that we get the community advisory panel or neighborhood advisory board structure and duties and oversight correct, I think is the key piece, because we could do all this other fancy stuff, and if the land bank does not have neighborhood level control, if we allow the developers, allow the anchor institutions to be able to have sway, and not to be and not pay people for the work that they're doing toward development, I think the whole situation is blown. And so, as much like we focus very heavily, there were other pieces that we, transparency was very important in terms of the open meetings and the reporting and the data analysis. All of that is good, but none of that's going to matter if the people with the decision-making authority are not the people with the lived experience, and a broad swath of people with lived experience, not just, let me just be frank, not just the Biddy Brigade, not just them, but everybody, right? Everybody that has been impacted by this, because that could include somebody who was evicted or foreclosed and displaced out of, or lost a home due to tax sale, their family home due to tax sale. It includes all of that. And so we have to make sure that those people are included in the planning process, right? For neighborhoods, but also that they're included in the neighborhood advisory, in the neighborhood advisory piece, the oversight piece as well.
And our unhoused community too.
Absolutely. Because they're unhoused because they're unhoused because, right?
Exactly. So completely agree with you there. And my next question for you is, what are some things, right, that are important that you would urge community members, right, as it relates to fighting for and protecting kind of the legacies of their communities and as it relates to this legislation?
So one of the key pieces, I cannot speak strongly enough about this. People have to get an estate plan. And I know people probably looking at this like, I don't even own property. I don't have an estate. But an estate plan, in addition to dealing with your assets, whatever they may be, an estate plan will enable you to make decisions for your care and for your money, should you not be able to make those decisions for yourself. So this applies to everybody. And then if you have assets, if you have a house or whatever, it allows you to say what should happen to your property once you are gone. So having a estate plan or a family continuity plan is very, very key, because a lot of the properties that sit vacant are sitting vacant in our city right now are sitting vacant because someone owned them and did not have an estate plan, did not have things set up so that when they passed on, the property would easily be transitioned to the next generation. So that is a very, 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 very important thing to do. We have to be checking on our folks that have properties in these neighborhoods, making sure that the properties are in good condition, whether you gotta, come together as a family and do some mutual aid, or whether you are walking someone through the lights program or civic works and some of these other programs to make sure that these properties are in good condition. We have to, I can't say this enough. You got to check, make sure people's water bills are paid. You got to make sure them property taxes are paid. We have to do that. And we have to watch the tax assessments, because as the properties around them begin to get developed, it shoots up their assessment. And if they don't have the homestead tax credit, it could triple, we can see bills double and triple. And that makes it unaffordable, and then people end up getting pushed out. So these are the types of things that we can do. The other piece is, as irritating as it is, folks really have to be about the business of getting engaged in policy making. You have to, because one of the things that we hear all the time when we're in city council or down in Annapolis is, where are the affected parties? Now, I know where the affected parties are. The affected parties are at work.
At work.
The affected parties are taking somebody to the doctor's office. The affected parties are at the children's school. The affected parties are really busy living. But we have to figure out ways to make time to understand what is going on and to engage where we can. And that could mean calling your city council person and saying, hey, what's up with this land bank stuff? Or calling them and saying, we got a neighbor and I looked at the tax sale list and they on there. What kind of programs can you tell me about to help them? Really engaging, letting them know when they are passing legislation that is harmful. Right. So those are 2 or 3 things that we really can do that kind of shift, and also to really start to think about what is possible. One of the things I heard Davon Love say from LBS say that one of the things that one of the worst things that racism did is it robbed Black people of our ability to imagine a world without whiteness. We've really had to spend some
ourselves at the center,
thinking about like what our neighborhoods could be when we have the fullness of our agency, when we are expressing the fullness of our agency. And it's really like, that is really key, because one of the main reasons why we were brought here, why we were trafficked here, is because of our agricultural genius, right? stonemasonry, all of these things. And so those are things that we can be tapping back into when we are thinking about stewardship, when we're thinking about reparations. This is how we reclaim. We reclaim those things. We get in the garden. And that helps to change, like that can help to change us, that can help to heal us. And those are the things that we can be really focused on as we're looking forward to doing this work.
Absolutely. Well, on that note, Nika, I think we can drop the mic. We've talked about, the background of this issue. We've talked about the legislation at hand. We've talked about land reclamation and land stewardship, why those things are important. We talked about land banks as a method of reparation. And also, we've really addressed what we all should be doing and how we can get engaged in this work, not just in the Campaign for Community Control, but in this work at large. So I just want to say thank you for your time today. I want to thank you for your energy. I want to thank you for your genius, for your expertise, and for sharing with such passion and with just such authenticity. We really appreciate it. And I know that, the folks who are here now and the folks who will watch this later, because even though we're live streaming now, we're going to post this. This, I think, needs to be seen, and it'll be available for those people who were unable to make it today. So that said, I think we're going to go ahead and tune out. We have one person who's on our stream right now. So I'm going to give you a chance, watcher. If you have any questions for us, go ahead and drop it in the chat. But if not, we're going to bring it to a close. So I'll give you an opportunity to do so.
Let's put it in the chat.
Drop it in the chat if you got it. All right. It doesn't look like anybody has any questions. So with that said, I'm going to say good night. And for those of you, again, who want to get involved, make sure you follow us everywhere at Create Community Control on Instagram, on TikTok, and go ahead and visit our website, which is www.createcommunitycontrol.org. Thanks again, Nika. We appreciate it. You have a good rest of your night.
You too.
Awesome.